let's start with the third chapter of 2nd Nephi, just to show we're rushing along here. Excuse me. It's a genealogical chapter, and it has strange phenomena in it, which occur in genealogy all the time. If you've done any work in genealogy, you know that certain names have a way of popping up all along, and certain relationships turn up where you don't expect them at all. Now, notice in the first verse he compares Joseph as a lost child, the last born in the wilderness. Well, Joseph was the lost child. Remember, he was sold by his brethren into Egypt and dropped down a well and picked up by a caravan and taken into Egypt. His brethren were all down on him, and but he has a home. May the Lord consecrate unto thee this land, he says in the second verse. So he'll have a place to go. Joseph did. Then, Joseph, my lastborn, who was brought out of the wilderness of mine afflictions, may the Lord bless thee forever. Thy seed shall not utterly be destroyed. Always the survival of Nephites in the New World also. And then we have something of a survey here. He says, I'm a descendant of Joseph. Now it's this name Joseph that they play on, but this is a characteristic thing in genealogy, I say, and of course Joseph is very special. But the fact that it should be the same Joseph leading right down to Joseph Smith should not surprise you. We used to require everybody to read, first year college, everybody read Henry Adams, Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, in which he shows how in the 12th century, time of William the Conqueror, well, 1066, we make it the 11th century, everybody in Europe was related, and they were. We had to be, with the 3 million people living in France and England. Within a few generations they would all be intermarried, and this is the way it actually turns out. And so we have something like the Assizes of Jerusalem, that amazing document. You see, when Jerusalem was taken in the First Crusade, 1095, they set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem there. First it was Geoffrey Bouillon, who was the Duke of Lorraine. And he died in 1100, and then his brother Baldwin I became the first king of Jerusalem. Then we had the line of Baldwins and so forth. But the people you have at Jerusalem represent all the royal families of Europe. And you have there, in that crusade, was Robert, who was the son, Robert of Normandy, who was the son of William the Conqueror, to whom you're all related if you've done any genealogy. All you have to do, you just get one name in nobility, and then you're related to all of them. And of course, everybody likes it. That saves you a lot of work, you see. So all you have to do is get one name, and then you go down the line as if there was nobody but nobility living in Europe. But they are all related, and this is what happens with the Assizes of Jerusalem. Anyone who gets to be king of Jerusalem was king of all the world, because he could relate himself to every royal family in the world, as far as that goes. And it's very easy to hook up on that. I know my wife's genealogy has scads and scads of it was nobility around the Baltic. It was Estonian and Polish, and once you get into that, you're into everything else. But she's from the line of the Reverend Leighton. And this we can trace back. I mean, Joseph Smith's from that line, Brigham Young's from that line, Heber C. Kimball's from that line, George Washington's from that line. They all come down. Everybody is related. All of colonial America is related. Well, they came from one part of England originally, certain parts of them, and they were very much intermarried and so forth. And so you have this bedizening network of relationships, just a mesh that go together. That's a fascinating thing that happens here. And so we have in the, and then there was Raymond of Toulouse, who was the son of Philip I of France. The interesting thing is that all these people have very strange relationships with Jerusalem before. You may note that book that's caused such a sensation in Europe, called Holy Grail, Holy Blood, the Holy Grail being their genealogies. And all these families are related, but you notice Toulouse, that was never Roman Catholic at all. Toulouse was the hotbed of the Baptists and so forth. And Raymond of Toulouse, and then we have, along with them, we have the Sicilian family, of course. I remember Robert of Normandy also ruled in Sicily and the like. And so you get this Holy Grail stuff. But the Assizes of Jerusalem are supposed to be the constitution for the ruling of the world from Jerusalem. But the court and the kingdom would be there. So they set it up there. And the most magnificent pageantry you can imagine. It was all show, but what a show. I mean, this is the Middle Ages at its peak. I mean, the pageantry, the processions, the gaudiness, the decorations, and all based around the temple. See, the Templars, the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, they were the Hospitallers that gave hospitality to people coming to the temple, all mystically associated with the temple somehow or other. It's really something. Well, we won't get into that. I'm just showing you that this short chapter here, was not so short, on genealogy, it might not be so cockeyed as it looks, but the way these things keep coming out. Now here, for example, and the spanning of time is a fascinating thing. I was just thinking here, I have two various grandchildren, of which I'm excessively fond of. The last two, 3.5 and 2.5 and 3 years old, are terribly smart. Now, I'd like to go with these little nippers and walk along the canal and so forth. They see everything, they talk about everything, they know everything and so forth. That's wonderful. And so you cuddle them and you kiss them and all this sort of thing. That's nice. Now, I was treated the same way by my grandfather, great-grandfather, John Patrick Reed, and he was born in 1825, and these children will probably be living, I figure, in 2078 at least, if they live as long as I do. So here I am, intimately associating with people living over a span of 253 years. That's what our lifespans cover. It's not, I mean, knowing them intimately. I've known intimately people 253 years apart. So you can jump over times in a very short period, and you'll find yourself related to all the Crusaders and everything else. It's an amazing thing, this family business. But it isn't as exclusive and as snobbish as you think it is, you see, because nobody can be snobbish. We all have crooks in our family and everything else. And very interesting things turn up that you never expect. Now, we'd given up on the name NIBLEY, which turns up in odd places and times, until just very recently, my cousin Preston got doing some serious work back in Scotland, and a very favorite place of mine. For some reason, I always felt fascinated by the name Elphinstone. It was the first place where the Norse landed when they came to Scotland, northern Scotland. The whole lowlands of Scotland, you see, are Scandinavian, and from way back. And here there's this town of Elphinstone, the Stone of the Elves. That sounds rather romantic, you know, they landed there. But it just turns out that there were 3 mayors of Elphinstone in succession, all called Hugh Nibley, you see. I'd never seen my name anywhere before at all. Something's going on here. It gives you goose flesh, you see. So when he talks about this Joseph business, you may well take it seriously. He talks about another Joseph and so forth, and it goes on down the line. And, and the important thing, notice, a great deal is said in this chapter about records, about written records, about a written connection, and that's all you have. You notice here, wherefore the fruit of thy loins shall write, the fruit of the loins of Judah shall write, and what is written shall be, by the fruit of thy loins shall grow together to the confounding of false doctrines, so forth, in the latter days. So it's turning out. And a great deal said, notice, but I will write unto him my law with my finger. He says about Moses, you see. God says, I will write unto him my law by the finger of mine own hand, and I will make a spokesman for him. The primacy of writing is very interesting, but what do you find? Some of you may have seen that, the most recent geographic, I think it is, on prehistoric men and so forth, tracing them back. But there's something, not much in that, but the fact is that you will find, you see, writing is the oldest thing. The written document, handing round the visible written document you find there. The written record is to be, you will find these hand marks on caves, for example, which are individual marks of possession. The person, remember, put their hands on the caves and then they spray it with paint by blowing it from their mouths. And you find the same thing in China, and you find the same thing in Spain, and you find the same thing in the caves of Austria and Australia, I should say, not Austria, but Australia. They do the same things on the walls there. Back to most primitive times, they're marks of, but aside from that, they put marks. They're definite symbols and marks. That's the wasm of the Arabs. The wasm, you put your mark on something. Put your mark, it's your name, it's your identity, and it identifies you with a cave or piece of property, especially with an arrow. The first long anthropological article I've published was on the arrow, the hunting in the state, and it's on the marking of arrows as a prehistoric way of establishing your identity to whatever you shot, to the lands and everything else. That's the crest you have in Scotland. I mean, your crest is the mark, is the pattern of colors, threads on your arrow, so that you can identify it. Wherever you go, it identifies you, and it's the crest of your house, and you weave it opposite directions in your plaid, and you wear it as a plaid, and it identifies your house. So they call it the crest. It's the mark, it's your identification. But this writing and marking of things, the oldest thing we have here, it's very necessary. It establishes identity and it establishes control. And so when we're talking about identity here and genealogy and passing over thousands of years, that is the written record. It is very important to do. Notice again in the 18th verse, that he shall write the writing of the fruit of thy loins, and it's as if it was coming from the dust. And of course the value of the Dead Sea Scrolls records is that they are written documents, and the minute they were dug up, these kids in the caves there, and in the caver, they could read them, just like that, though they were 1,000 years old, 2,000 years old, at least. And so they cry from the dust in repentance, and therefore thy seed shall not be destroyed. This has to do, see, with the bridging of time and space, and also of humanity. As Brother Packer would talk about it last night, you see. We are the human family, and that is something unique, and we do come from one ancestor, from one common source. Well, that's a thing that's coming back. The biologists are bringing that back a lot. I don't mean about Adam, but the necessity, a thing they'd given up long ago, that we had multiple origins. There must have been, multiple origins have been dropped now, it seems, by most biologists, that it just does come from one ancestor as far as that goes. Well, that's another thing. But what we're dealing here is the big picture. We get a scope and a span, a sweep here, that is quite remarkable. So then we have Lehi, of course, summing up with a patriarchal blessing. He blesses his sons, daughters, we see. He's spoken concerning Joseph, Joseph prophesied concerning thy seed and concerning us and future generations. Now notice in the 3rd verse, we're on the 4th chapter now, we're rushing along. He calls the children of Laman. He doesn't call Laman. He doesn't bless Laman and Lemuel. He doesn't give them blessing. He blesses their children, because it's their children who survive, and it's their children who are blessed. And he says, he calls him my firstborn. Behold my sons and daughters, who are the sons and daughters of my firstborn. But it's not the firstborn he's blessing, you'll notice. I would that it's the way it's the way Isaac crossed his hands when he blessed Jacob and Esau. He reversed the blessing on Esau. He wouldn't give it to him. And the same thing with the blessing on Manasseh in the Isaiah, the Ascension of Isaiah text, a very old text discovered. I should leave a blessing with you. He's not going to leave them without a blessing. Therefore, if you are cursed, behold, I leave my blessing upon you. Because of my blessing, the Lord God will be merciful unto you and your seed forever. And then to Laman, he caused the sons and daughters of Lemuel to be brought before him and gave him the same blessing. My second son, I've given you the same blessing as the other. And then the sons of Ishmael the same. And then he blesses Sam. Thou shalt be like thy brother, who's always been Nephi's strongest support here. And so then we get to, he died, and after his death, Laman and Lemuel and his sons, the old feud bursts out anew worse than ever, you notice in the 13th verse. Were angry with me after his death. They've been holding off because, out of respect for their father, probably. Now he says, upon these things I write the things of my soul. And here we get a very interesting character analysis of Nephi. He really pours it on here and shows an interesting and inflicting, we'd say a complex and difficult character is Nephi. He writes the things of his soul in many of the scriptures. His soul delighteth in the scriptures, in the writings, and my heart pondereth them and writeth them from learning. That sounds like a verse out of the Talmud, doesn't it? And writeth them for the learning and profit of my children. Well, but then he goes on, nevertheless, and notwithstanding all the great goodness of the Lord to him. In the 17th verse, what does he say there? He says, O my heart exclaimeth, O wretched man that I am. My heart sorroweth because of my flesh. My soul grieveth because of mine iniquities. Well, what is he up to that's so sinful? You notice he's always under this steady pressure from his brethren, and now it's burst out anew, and it's very bad, you see, after Lehi has died. And he's just about ready to give up here. He says, I am encompassed about because of the temptations and sins which so easily beset me. What's he tempted to do? We soon find out here. To play a rough game is what he's tempted to do. I mean, he wants to hit back at Laman and Lemuel. And he has a short temper, and remember, he really lets fly at times. And the dispatching of Laman wasn't his idea, but his impulsive grabbing of Zoram, holding his mouth and telling him nothing to fear and so forth, instead of arguing with him properly. He says he was large and strong and he could handle Zoram easy enough, and so he did. But then here, when my heart desires to rejoice, my heart groaneth because of my sins. What could they have been? As I say, what are sins? You see, again, you can't classify them. You can't be like the like the 16th century probabilists like Molinos and the famous Catalogue of Sins, and exactly some rate each sin according to a number, and as much 3 or 4 decimal places exactly which sin is worse than which sin. So you can't do that, of course, because sin is a state of mind. And so, behold, he hath heard my cry by day, and he hath given me my knowledge and visions by nighttime. I have sent up my voice I have sent up on high. Angels have come down and ministered to you. And here is a very interesting ascension text here, this 25th one here. And upon the wings of the Spirit hath my body been carried up, carried away on exceeding high mountains, in the plural, and mine eyes have beheld great things, yea, even too great for man. Therefore I was bidden I should not write them. Well, what's he talking about? Well, he says they're too great for us. They're out of our league here. What's been happening to him in these 8 years in the desert? He really had some experiences. But if I've seen so great things, you say, why is my heart weep and my soul linger? Why am I not happy in that case? See, this is man's condition he gives us here beautifully. Why should my heart and soul linger in the valley of sorrow, and my flesh waste away, and my strength slacken because of mine afflictions? Well, he's had plenty of afflictions. After 8 years, he's had on more than he can stand, and they're about to break loose and go off by themselves. But here, it's because he's reached a peak here. He can't, as if he couldn't take it anymore, you see. Mine afflictions. Why should I yield to sin because of my flesh? Well, there is where the weakness comes here. Now, he says, why should I give way to temptation that the evil will have place in my heart? Now, here's a very nice thing. This, what we have here, this is who you have to blame for your troubles. Say, with 8 years of tension, his passionate nature comes out here. He is brooding. He is self-accusing. He hit back to the brethren. He's impulsive. He's also physical. And he comes out with a confession here. He gives way to the temptations of the evil that have a place in his heart to destroy my peace and afflict my soul, his peace of mind and so forth. He just gets mad. You get all upset. You can imagine losing sleep and tossing and this sort of thing that happens to all of us. You shouldn't be peeved about these things, but that's the way we are. Why am I angry because of my enemy? Why blame him? Why get all upset because of him, my enemy? It's all right to go my way and have trouble, but be angry because, why get mad at him? He says, awake my soul, no longer drooping. He calls that sin, you see. Because it is. He's wasting. Sin is waste, the scriptures tell us. And you're wasting time and energy with anger because it's not going to get you anywhere. Righteous anger. But this is a brooding anger against his brothers that have been going on and on and on, you see. Why am I angry because of my enemy? Awake my soul, no longer droop in sin. Rejoice my heart. Give place no more to the enemy of my soul. There's the enemy. Do not anger because of my enemies. Don't slacken my strength because of my afflictions. See, he's ready to let up. He's not going to follow it through. He's been losing his resolve or something, but don't slacken strength because of his afflictions. Expect your afflictions. Then he keeps telling himself he should rejoice. See the positive side. Rejoice, O my heart, and cry unto the Lord, and say, O Lord, I will praise thee forever. My soul rejoices. And that's fine. O Lord, and then here we come to this marvelous desert image, this little vignette here we have. The person fleeing through the desert from his enemies, wanting the Lord to block up the way of those who are chasing him, going to the tent, going in and bowing down to the Lord of the tent and asking him to place his robe around him for protection and say, I am your protector now. He's a member of the tribe. And the sheik, the shaykh, is bound to protect him as a member of the family then. When he says ahlan, that means both family and it means tent. At the same time, the tent is yours and marhaban, you have place. And so we saw that have place business before. So, here he goes now. May the gates of hell be shut continually before me, because that my heart is broken and my spirit contrite. O Lord, wilt thou not shut up the gates of righteousness before me, that I may walk now in the path of the low valley, that's the way to get through the shortcut, and may be strict in the plain road, stick to the tarak, to the plain. O Lord, wilt thou encircle me round with thy robe, with the robe of thy righteousness. You see, that's the idol. See, that's what atonement is. What's the robe, the flap of the tent, of the kaperet. Yes, it's the tent of the kaperet. That's what it's called. When the Lord opens that and takes you into his tent, takes you into he forgives the people. Well, we talked about that before, or did we? I don't know. Maybe in another class. But this. And so you encircle me. Wilt thou make a way for mine escape before my enemies? Wilt thou make my path straight before me? Wilt thou not place a stumbling block in my way? See, that's a kashal, we met that before. Eh? But that thou wouldst clear thy way before me, and hedge up not my way, but the way of my enemy. That's what you want. That's what the Arab poet prays for, and so forth. Now this is a confession here. You'll see here this next verse here, where he says, "O Lord, I have trusted in thee, and I will trust in thee forever. I will not put my trust in the arm of flesh." Remember, he was a very powerful guy. He was their best hunter, and he was the toughest character of them all, I'm sure. He was physically a very mighty man, as he tells us. "I will not trust in the arm of flesh." I won't do that anymore, he says. "For I know that cursed is he that puts his trust in the arm of flesh." It's sort of a confession, you see. I know that cursed is he that says, "I'm in trust in the arm of flesh." Of course, all force begets counterforce and so forth. You're not going to profit by that. "Yea, cursed is he that putteth his trust in the man, or maketh flesh his arm." There's your peace through strength sort of nonsense. Then, "I will cry unto thee, my God, my rock, and my righteousness." Of course, the rock in the desert. This is what David uses. He's quoting Psalms here when he flees from his enemies. Remember, David was in flight a good deal of the time, fleeing for his life with a small company, hiding out in the desert and the rocks, Asad and so forth. "The rock of my righteousness, behold, my voice shall forever ascend up unto thee, my rock and mine everlasting." Amen. So there's a nice picture of Nephi there. And then comes the big break in chapter 5 here. There is the big break. "And I did cry much because of the anger of my," and cry to God much because of the anger. See, that's what he's doing. This is a cry to God, and what's the cause of it? The anger of his brothers. They won't let up. See this first verse of chapter 5. They're relentless. They're obsessed. Nephi is the enemy as far as they're concerned. They'll never forgive him for that. "But behold, their anger did increase." It only got worse after that. See, when he called upon the Lord, this prayer that just went before didn't cure them at all. Their anger only got worse, insomuch that they finally sought to get rid of Nephi. Now, what's he going to do? "They murmured against me," and this is what they were down on, of course. He thinks to rule over us, and after all, when you have a small company together have to keep together for years and years, you're always going to have short tempers and anger. People in the desert, many films, plays, and so forth built on that particular theme. See, the people just can't abide each other after a while. "Our younger brother thinks he'll rule over us, and we have much trial because of him. He's to blame. Wherefore let's slay him, that we may not be afflicted any more because of his words." They're getting under our skin. We're not going to have any more. "For we will not have him to be our ruler, for it belongs to us, who are the elder brethren, to rule over this people." Naturally. "Came to pass the Lord warned him." It was time to get out now. The Lord warned him that he should depart from them and flee into the wilderness. And here we have another break. Here we have the Rechabites again. They're breaking off. This is the beginning of the division between the Nephites and the Lamanites then. "And he took his family, and he took Zoram, and also his family." So the Zoramites are Nephites henceforth. There are 5 families here. "And Sam, an elder brother, and his family, and Jacob and Joseph, the 2 brethren, the youngest ones. And also my sisters," he took their family. Well, that's more than 5 families, isn't it? Because they'd be married to men outside. "And all of those who would go with me," well, that's another group. Anyone who was willing to go, regardless of family and so forth. "And all of those who would go with me," see, these little things escape you if you don't notice them. And you would say just you went with 5 families. No, there are 5 families, and his sister's families too, some of them, and anybody else that wanted to join. "Any of those who believed in the warnings and revelations of God," they were out there on a warning anyway, you see, so here they go. "And we did take our tents and journey in the wilderness." Well, this is where I came in, you see, the old story again. "And the journey in the wilderness of many ways." Well, now mezzo del camino nostrovita. See, we're in the middle of the journey all the time in the dark and dreary world, as Dante starts us out. "And so we should call the name of the place Nephi. And they journeyed in the wilderness for many days." Now, we don't know how many is. You see, Book of Mormon geography is a waste of time. So I wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot pole. Never had. It's not necessary, you see. But someday we'll get more information out of it, I suppose. Everybody's tried their hand on it. I don't know why. It doesn't make any difference. "And they journeyed in the wilderness for many days, and they pitched their tents," and they'd been doing this in Egypt, the way you do, set up a permanent camp. "They called the place Nephi after themselves." Well, we have a place in Utah called Nephi, if I recall. We do name things. We have a place called Brigham, settled because who was a settler and so forth. And we call it a place called Provo, because Provost, of course, Etienne Provost was a hunter who made his camp here, his base here in the early days. "That we should call the name of the place Nephi," but this was written before Provo ever was, you see. Remember back in the 1820s here. "And all those who were with me did take upon them to call themselves the people of Nephi," which is natural enough. The Brighamites, the Josephites, the Smithites, and so forth. People always name themselves after the followers. Their followers are in Alexandria or anything else. "And the Platonists and Aristotelian," those names are ancient. They went back to their followers. The Platonists called themselves Platonists, followers of Plato, and according to the law of Moses. The basic law is still the law of Moses. They're still living by the Old Testament. And this comes out, when we get to Alma, you will see more light cast on the Old Testament practices described in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, especially Exodus and Leviticus, than anywhere else. But they're living by the law of Moses. That's the basic law. So they always specify, we know that salvation doesn't come by it. It just points their minds forward. And notice we were taught a number of times earlier that they brought all manner of seed over here. Now we know things like barley and almost all the crops in the world. It's very hard to find where they originally came from because they were planted by other people who moved in. It's easy to carry seeds with you, and people do, all over the place. So did emmer wheat really originate in Palestine, or was it in northern Egypt in an earlier time? And which place is barley? Barley is the common Babylonian measure and so forth, but barley you find all over Asia, and you find it in the New World too from the very beginning. So the spreading of these things, well, any seed will grow. The soil is very impartial here. So they plant the seeds, and you have all sorts of crops here, as corn went back to the old world. But the seeds, and they did raise flocks. Flocks, that's an interesting thing too, because the flocks of various kinds. What would it be, vicuñas or llamas or something like that? They're all the sheep family. And they herd them today, of course. Upon plates of brass, they had the plates and brass, and they have the national treasures with them. And he took the sword of Laban and used it as a pattern to make more swords. Lest by any means the people who were now called Lamanites, they were calling them Lamanites. It's Lamanites for the record. Whether they call themselves Lamanites isn't the idea, but they were Lamanites, you see. And they built many buildings and got to work. And one of the first things he did, they built a temple and constructed after the manner of the Temple of Solomon. And this is one of those points for which the Book of Mormon was often criticized. There was only one temple, and that was the temple at Jerusalem. The Jew wouldn't build another temple. We know that's not so. It's 1925. The Elephantina records, of course, from Upper Egypt. The people who left Jerusalem at the time of Lehi, went up the Nile to Elephantina, to the first cataract, and there was a large settlement of Jewish mercenaries working for the king of Ethiopia at that time, and they asked for permission to build a temple. They wrote letters back to the committee in Jerusalem, asked to the grand rabbi back there. Well, of course, this is 525 when the letters come at a later period, and it was written to the temple committee, which would have been the high priests, the scribes, and it's to the high priest. We have a number of those letters asking for permission to build a temple. The permission is granted. It's built after the manner of Solomon's temple, of course, but they don't have the materials. It's much cheaper, a smaller building, but they did. And then later on, under the influence of the same dynasty, up north, Oni, a very famous, called the circle drawer, he went and built a model of the temple again at Heliopolis, where the Jews could worship in Egypt. Because that's where they all went, you see, when Jerusalem fell, most of them. Alexandria became the biggest Jewish city in the world, just as New York is today. And so he built this temple, and he said it was after the man. Naturally, he used the pattern of Solomon's temple, but not of so many precious things. They couldn't afford that. Solomon's temple was really a show, as you know. They weren't found upon the land, therefore he couldn't be built like unto Solomon's temple, but substitutes. The manner of construction was like to the Solomon's temple, and the workmanship was like it. The materials weren't. But it was the best workmanship we could do. Where was it? Yes, they're building a temple in Portland, to my great surprise. The person from there who was on the building committee, he said the workers were absolutely ecstatic. They're not members of the church, the workers who are building it. They're ecstatic because they're not only allowed, but they're instructed and ordered to use the costliest and best materials and the finest workmanship they possibly can. Now, any other contractor in building is going to save money and cut corners, you see. Look at the apartments springing up around Provo there. They're tenements, fire traps, you name them. But for a builder in this day and age to be told, use the best materials and the best, even if it's the costliest, the best workmanship you can get, possibly. Well, that's the sort of thing any real craftsman or artisan dreams of, but gets very few chances at today. Because today, of course, you got to save money, minimum of expense. It has to be cost effective and all the rest of it, you see. But he says here, the workmanship was exceeding fine. They make a point of that on the temple, and of course it should be. But Nephi was desired they should run out, and naturally they wanted to make Nephi their chief. He'd been running things all along anyway, so why shouldn't he be chief? They were desirous to have him king, but that was too much of a title for him. But I did for them as much as I could, according to my power, he says, and they looked up to him as their king and leader. Now, now this cursing, there's a great deal said about this race business in the Book of Mormon. It's very clear what it is. It's a cultural thing throughout, as it tells us here, just at this beginning part. Wherefore they were exceedingly fair, white, fair, and delightsome. Now, that doesn't mean they had complexions of milk or anything like that, does it? That they were pale white and ghostly. That's not healthy anyway. Nor does it mean that the others were coal black. Black is much too strong a word to use here if you're using it literally. But as I said before, in Arabic, but it applies just as much as in Shachar and Lavan, as it does in Hebrew and Aramaic, as it does in Arabic, where it's Abyad or Aswad. Anything that's Abyad is good, delightful, pleasant, and everything that's Aswad is. And of course, in the paintings, and whether it's Greek vase paintings or whether it's wall paintings in Egypt, the people that live in the Beit al-Shahar, in the houses of hair out in the desert, are always painted with dark complexions. And the people that live in the Beit al-Shahar, in the Beit al-Hajar, in the houses of stone, are always depicted with light complexions. The women never went out. They would paint their faces with white lead, as a matter of fact. Well, it's a cultural thing, of course. If you live that way, you become dark. And also, added to that, you see, if you become, well, the camps of natives, Asiatics, or anything like that, they become garbage dump. You live by hunting, and you don't want to. You're not cultivating the soil. You're not bound to work too much or anything like that, and by plunder and things like that. So you become slovenly and dark in your manner. You become dirty and different and smelly and all that sort of thing. That's what you mean by loathsome. You see, dirty, smelly, not very well groomed or anything like that. And this is a cursing, and they became, I see, when you see a person white and exceeding fair and delightsome, I see you're not going to see a platinum blonde here necessarily. Though you do find them. This is an interesting thing. It's a thing that always bowled me over among the Hopis. Every 10th child is a blonde, not an albino at all. They'll have red hair and blue eyes. And I thought, well, this is obviously some missionaries or other, or somebody's intermarried, some Scandinavians. That wasn't it at all. These were all native Hopi kids, and every 10th one was a perfectly good blonde. I mean, as blonde as anybody you ever saw. And yet quite normal. Nobody was upset by it or anything like that. And exceedingly fair and delightsome. And the other was a skin of blackness. Well, I say aswad, that's a skin of blackness, means dark. A good source of that would say would be see Jastro's Aramaic dictionary. There it gives the black as shoha, as dark, unpleasant, everything sort of down on it, uncomplimentary in that. Well, we don't need to linger on that. And then, and the cursing was, no, here it is, you see, it says it's a cultural affair. And if you mix your seed with them, you got the same cursing. Again, you're sharing their culture, and you intermarry with them the same way, you become just like them. In other words, it is not a racial thing, because you can get it yourself. Notice their cursing which came upon them, they did become an idle people, full of mischief and subtlety, and seek in the wilderness for beasts of prey. Well, lots of races like that. We have lots of, all you have to do is watch, I guess it's Channel 6, and you can be introduced to all sorts of tribes like that. 26, isn't it, on TV? Yeah, almost steadily, this National Geographic stuff. You see tribes like that everywhere. Not that they don't have their virtues, and the Lamanites certainly did. But racial change isn't necessary for this at all, you see, because it's not. After all, they are members of the same family. We know that. And then this is the point, you see. This is why the Lord, as he tells us back in 1 Nephi, the 2nd chapter already, right at the beginning of the book, there in the 23rd verse, he tells them, he says, I want them breathing down your neck. I'm going to keep the Lamanites there to keep you in line. They may stir you up to remembrance. You're never going to solve the Lamanite problem by trying to beat them, by any arms or weapons or anything you can do. That's not the way you solve things. I want those people giving you trouble. They shall be a scourge to stir unto thy steeds, to stir them up in remembrance of me. Inasmuch as they will not remember me and hearken unto my words, they shall scourge them even to destruction. Here's a promise. If your people do not obey me, the Lamanites are there to destroy you. They'll scourge you until you're destroyed. That makes it very clear. Well, and Nephi consecrated Jacob to be a priest and teacher. So Nephi was not to be, Jacob was not to be his successor in the government. They start appointing chiefs by the name of Nephi as they give them that title, just as Caesar. Caesar's successor was called Caesar, and ever after the person who held the title was called the Caesar. So it was, excuse me, So it was a personal name originally. and here's an interesting thing. He lived after the manner of happiness. Don't ever grind your own wheat, people. Always gets stuck in your throat. And it came to pass that we lived after the manner of happiness. Now, what on earth is the manner of happiness? It's very interesting. There is a regime that assures happiness, and of course it's a state of mind. That's all there is. And it's a state of mind that goes with every way of life, whether you're living in the desert, or whether you're living in the clouds, or wherever you're living, whether it's in the city or in the country. There is a manner of happiness. And if you are not happy, that means you're not living the right way. You're supposed to be happy. They're living after the manner of happiness. But you say, egads, just these few families, these few people, living out in the sticks all by themselves, weren't they bored stiff? Now, this is an interesting phenomenon. Where you find boredom is not in such places, but in the midst of the greatest civilizations. That's where people get bored, because they get replete and so forth. Now, look at the literature. Look at the novels of the French, a whole lot of them, Proust, for example, or of the English, all sorts. It's the English murder mystery. The people living in the country house, absolutely bored beyond, well, in London the same thing. Everybody's absolutely bored stiff, nobility, you see. But especially the Russian novels. Lermontov, Tolstoy has a novel called Chordy Ludi. Difficult people. The classic situation, see, is the rich baron, the rich Russian family. This is before the revolution. They had everything their way, and they would just live around and got bored until they started committing suicide and having duels and murders and everything else. And this happens in the other ones. The French would always say, "Il n'y a rien à faire." There's nothing to do. And the Russian slogan was "Sto dělat, skutno I grustno," boring, disgusting their life is. And they're the people that have everything. There's the rich landowners and so forth. And the same thing with the Polish novels, though, and I haven't read any of them for a long time. I used to read myself to sleep with Russian novels, and they were good ones to put you to sleep, because these people were so bored with their lives. Sometimes they'd impulsively, in one story called The Duel by Lermontov, two house guests get so bored and disgusted they decide to just have a duel and kill each other because there's nothing else to do. Well, but no, boredom goes with civilization as much as anything. You won't say these people are, because these people are out there by themselves, they're going to be bored insufferably, beyond endurance. Life in a monastery can't be, but there again you have the idea of a few people shut up together. There's no more enlightening and terrifying document than Browning's soliloquy in a Spanish cloister. Yeah. The last word, "Gur, you swine." One of the brethren is jealous. Well, they're jealous of each other, hate each other's guts and so forth, because they're shut in, they're locked in together, doing this pious routine all the time, year after year after year. That would really be boredom. But what do you do not to be bored? What do you do to live after the manner of happiness? Whoopee, you see. Well, now, as Brother Packer told us, also from the Book of Mormon, wickedness never was happiness. You're not going to get it by kicking the gong around and indulging in this, that, and the other. That's a very interesting thing. Again, you see, my youngest son was, of all places, he never graduated from high school. He was voted most likely to succeed, and he's a big wheel now, incidentally, but that's something else. But for a while, he danced with the San Francisco Ballet, of all things. You see, he tried everything. And the boys in Haight-Ashbury used to say, "Well, why don't you try the drugs? Why don't you try the sex? This, that, and the other." Wouldn't do any of that. He had a simple answer to any of them. He'd just look them in the eye and say, "Are you happy?" And usually they'd break out crying. They're utterly miserable. You see, this is the point, going to these excesses. You're not going to find fun that way. You quickly exhaust all the variety you can think of, and it becomes exceedingly depressing, as we know. Well, so the way of happiness, we have a perfect right, see? Man is that he might have joy, and our whole idea here is a country where we can have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it doesn't tell you how to pursue it. See, the Constitution, and you're not supposed to tell me, I'm not supposed to tell you. But there are ways of pursuing happiness, until your joy becomes uncontrollable, just absolutely wild, and it's the love of the Lord. It's when the Lord blesses. You know that, you feel that. But you don't know what happiness is until that happens, and it will. Notice, here it is. There's the key right here in the 32nd verse here. It says, "And if my people are pleased with the things of God," They'll be pleased. So they're pleased with the things of God. That's enough to keep you happy all the time. It's a very interesting thing because you have lots of pioneer journals and things like that and things that went on. And there was amazingly little in some of these things. My mother was born in Manti and so forth, and we have various family journals and the like. There was amazingly little feuding and trouble. There is now, if you read Miss Marple and so forth, what happens in a little English village where everything seems to be so peaceful and kind. There's where the murders and the dirty plots and everything take place. But there's the little English villages and an establishment of many, many years. They're very ancient and established, and people have been living there, and they're living rather shallow lives. See, the gospel means nothing to them. Their lives are formality, very formal. Tea, for example, tea is the one thing around which everything settles, the nice cup of tea. And this is a formality. If we didn't have these formalities, we'd go crazy and fall apart. We have to do these little things like, that's why I was in Max Taylor, who was the commander of the 101st Airborne. He insisted that everybody in the division, no matter what the operation was, no matter what the circumstances were, shave every day. You had to. That was you'd be court-martialed if you didn't shave. Now, why should you shave every day of all things, especially if you were stuck in one muddy hot foxhole for 77 days, as I was once? It's a long time, holding the side of Arnhem there, but it was a morale thing. It kept you going. It was the only thing that kept your sanity. You had to do these little things. You had to shave, and you had to brush your teeth and all this sort of thing. And if you did that, that was fine. Then you ducked back awfully quick. But this living after the manner of happiness is a remarkable statement, I do believe. And we should pay more attention to things like that. And now we get on to the 6th chapter, the words of Jacob. Now, Jacob gets a word in here. We're going to have a book of Jacob. But he was consecrated to be a priest, so by Nephi, whom we look upon as king and protector. He wouldn't be appointed. He refused the office, but they look upon him as king and a protector. And he says, my anxiety is great. He's worried, you see. He's just as worried. Remember, he's their spiritual leader now, and he's as worried as Nephi was. And he's going to say, I'm going to give you a view of things to come. And he quotes Isaiah, as Nephi had been quoting Isaiah more than anything else, just like the Dead Sea Scrolls are Isaiah far before everything else. The Lord God should manifest himself in the flesh. Now he has the future of the Jews here. Now this is a thing that's gone through in the Book of Mormon a number of times. I'm going to skip over these chapters in Isaiah here. Yes, just pointing out some things. Blessed are the Gentiles, if they repent, fight not against Zion, nor unite themselves to that great and abominable church which they shall be saved. Well, that's a strange condition. All you have to do is not belong to a particular church. That should be very easy. That includes atheists and everything else. For the people of the Lord are they who wait for him, for they still wait for the coming of the Messiah, and very few did. The Messiah will come a second time then to glory unto the destruction of their enemies. He's giving them a preview of the comings of the Lord as in the Hebrew prophets. And then he says, believe not him, shall be destroyed both by fire and by tempest and so forth. For the mighty God shall deliver his covenant people, for thus saith the Lord, I will contend with them that contendeth with thee. And I will feed them on their own flesh, and they shall be drunken with their own blood. Well, he's quoting Isaiah here, and chapter 7 is just chapter 50 from Isaiah. And incidentally, you compare these chapters with those in the King James. They're not identical. There are various differences. I have a couple of pages, a section in that book called the Since Cumorah, in which I compare various passages, and there are key differences, some rather important. And the Book of Mormon follows the Septuagint rather than the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is 1,000 years later than the Septuagint. You see, Septuagint is 1,000 years earlier. It's Greek. It isn't the Hebrew. It's Greek, but it was translated by Hebrew scholars by 72, as the name shows, by 72 scholars from Jerusalem for the benefit of Ptolemy I of Egypt at Alexandria. They translated it, and they 1,000 years earlier than I knew what the Old Testament should sound like. And now you see we have another text of Isaiah, the Isaiah text from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is 1,000 years earlier than any Hebrew text of Isaiah. Now we can compare them, see what they're like. And again, the Isaiah is closer to the Septuagint. The Joseph Smith is closer to the Septuagint. The Dead Sea Scrolls is. So the King James Version is the one that strayed farthest. Well, it's latest, actually. It's not drastic, but there's some important points in it. Well, that's just in passing. And look unto Abraham and Sarah. Well, let's get to chapter 9 when he starts explaining it then. Now we're racing along here. That you know concerning the covenants. He's spoken to the Jews from the beginning down until now, until the time they shall be destroyed. And then later they shall be gathered home to the lands, plural, of their inheritance, and shall be established in all their lands of promise. So it's a wider movement than just the city of Jerusalem. And that ye may rejoice and lift up your heads forever. Our flesh must waste away and die. Now he comes to the study of the atonement and the resurrection here. This is important. The important thing is not what happens to Jerusalem, or what happens to the nation, or the church for that matter. It's what happens to you. I mean, if the whole thing is just going to pass away and go down into the dust and be forgotten forever. And this is the one where he talks about the second law of thermodynamics right here, you see. Here he says, our flesh must waste away and die. Well, it does do that, we notice. Nevertheless, in our bodies we shall see God. And remember Job, though the worms of the earth destroy my body, yet in the flesh shall I see God. Luther translated that because he didn't like it. Yet ohne das Fleisch, without the flesh I shall see God. All I did was put another word in there, not in the flesh, change it to without. Well, you can do that if you want, but that's not what the text said. I know in the body he shall show himself to those at Jerusalem. He promises the coming of Christ. For as death has passed upon all men to fulfill the merciful plan of... Now this word plan is going to be used a lot, and you can look up in Young's Concordance or anywhere else, the word plan does not occur once in the Bible. It's being used a great deal by preachers today. It was never used in Joseph Smith's day, but you see how it explains things. We can put up with an awful lot if we know it's according to plan. We can wait it out in that case. But the word plan is never found in the Bible. The rabbis didn't like it, among other things. No, the idea of the plan, which becomes very important here, that this is the way things are supposed to be. But this requires a pre-existence. And this requires a lot of other things that atonement does. You see, we talk about atonement, Yeshuvah, and Yeshiva. Yeshiva is the return to the place where you were before, return to God. Well, if you weren't there before, you see, that's one word for atonement they use in the Old Testament. The other, Yeshiva, means going in and sitting down sitting down beside him. It means going in and sitting down with your Father in heaven when you're taken into the presence of the Most High. And so Yeshua, all those words have to do with going back home and being received again. And that's what he's talking about here. This gives us great insight into the atonement doctrine, especially later on when we get it to Alma. But here he says here, death has passed upon all men. That's true, but that's part of the plan of the great Creator. There must needs be a power of the resurrection. Now, there's only one thing you can do if everything is going that way. If that's the natural course of things, what can you do about it? There has to be a power. Somebody has to intervene. There has to be somebody to intervene. Well, is that conceivable? Of course it's conceivable, the fact that we're here. Somebody intervened to get us here. We shouldn't be here. If we had just a mass of inert matter out there acting on itself this way and that way, accident and so forth, well, it looks like Matthew's work on the Newtonian apple and so forth. There's some great studies done on that. The statistical probability of our not existing, of course, is 1 trillion to 0. I mean, you're not supposed to be here. There's no chance of our being here by chance. And Wallace, the great biologist, used to say, there's only one argument why we should be here. Everything is against it. It's absurd. We're not here. And that's the fact we are here, you see. That shows that somebody's spoiling the game. They're not playing the right scientific game. Well, this is the whole point here. There must be a power to intervene. Because he says it is perfectly natural for things to die and stay dead, as far as that goes. He says here, the resurrection must needs come unto man by reason of the fall, because we fell, you see, and spoiled everything. And the fall came by reason of transgression. And because man became fallen, they were cut off. Now, see, that's the opposite of atonement, at one, to be at one. To be cut off, to be separated, is not to be at one anymore, and this is the opposite, and this is the penalty. And therefore, however, what are you going to do about this being cut off? There must be an infinite atonement here, bringing together in one. See, atonement is not just one in the presence of the Father, but the atonement of all things, the atonement of the flesh, bringing together things that were formerly separated. That's what at one is. See, that at one covers an awful lot of ground. I listed yesterday 40 different words in the Bible that they're equivalent of atonement, and sometimes are translated as atonement. See? 40 different expressions all mean atonement in different ways. But it all comes back to being at one. Good old atonement is the best word you can use, and so it says here, an infinite atonement, that is an unlimited capacity to recompose things that are broken down, to bring them back together as they were in their original state, you see. Restoring and integrating. Well, this is what you get in oxidation reduction, you see. Being oxidized, everything here, everything in the room is not only being dragged down by not only being dragged down by gravity, but we're being oxidized. Everything is slowly being burned up. And you can reverse that process by reduction, you see, by adding your OH radical and take care of that. But not all the way. But see, he's talking about a process, an infinite capacity, an infinite at-one-ment, an infinite capacity to put things together again, because it's going to have to be forever. And infinite atonement, he says, without that, then this corruption could not put on incorruption, because once things are rotted and crumbled and is corrupt, how is it possibly going to put on incorruption unless there is an unlimited power to do that very thing, to select it? Well, I see it time's nearly up. So, and so, then this is the this one really hits the gong. And if so, this flesh must have laid down, oh, wait a minute, wherefore the first judgment that came upon man must remain an endless duration, and if so, this flesh must have laid down to rot and crumble in the mother dust, to rise no more. Remember, you cannot reverse the process of entropy. It's the heat death. Things all wear down to a dead level, and you can't go anywhere after that because there's no place to go. And that's the way it would be, he says, if that wasn't for us, somebody had intervened and changed things. And then no wonder he breaks out. He says, how marvelous it is to know that there's something, that isn't it. That's not going to settle things. Oh, the wisdom of God, his mercy and grace. For behold, if the flesh should rise no more, our spirits must become subject to him. Why? Because they have yielded. It's the spirits that yield and sins. It's the spirit that went the way of the flesh. And the spirit is guilty. The flesh has gone out of, the flesh is finished. It's done. It's passed away forever. But there's a guilty spirit. It's got itself into this jam now. What's it going to do? Our spirits must be subject to the person who tempted it. It was the spirit that was tempted by Satan here, and they become devil and angels to the devil because they... Oh, incidentally, this ninth verse, I see the time is up now. Well, it isn't up, so we'll have to break it up. Better note it here, because this ninth verse is another one of those remarkable, concise summaries. It's shocking, but it's a good one. So we'll continue the next time.